There are things a piece of land will tell you if you are willing to be told. Most people are not. Most people drive past a tangled mess of brush and read only the tangle. The close-knit wall of buckthorn, the choked-out canopy, the ground beneath gone gray and bare as a swept floor because nothing can grow in the allelopathic shadow that glossy buckthorn throws. They read ruin, and they move on. Margaret Elsa Voss read something else. She was 26 years old, she had $400 to her name and a borrowed truck. And when the county tax assessor's office posted 45 acres of brushland for delinquent tax sale on the second Tuesday of March in the year 1887, she was the only person in Harlow County who raised a hand. The auctioneer had paused before opening the bidding, as if embarrassed on her behalf. 45 acres, Lot 7 of the Griswold parcel, he read from the sheet. And there was an audible shuffle in the folding chairs behind her, the particular shuffle of people composing their faces. She bid $280. No one countered. The gavel came down, and the room filled with the specific silence that is not quiet at all, but is in fact the loudest thing in the world. The silence of a room full of people agreeing, without speaking, that a young woman alone had just done something foolish. 3 years later, a wagon stacked with cedar posts arrived in Harlow to take an order for fencing from the most prosperous small operation in the county. The driver, a red-faced man named Creel, who did business from Duluth to the Iowa line, stepped down in front of the feed store and asked the men on the bench who had bought the old Griswold brush. One of them told him, and he stood for a moment with the invoice in his hand, turning it over, then said, quite simply, "I'll be damned." He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a man says it when the world has revealed an order he had not suspected was there. 2 years earlier than that is where the real story begins. Margaret had known about the Griswold parcel since she was a child sitting on the tailgate of her father's wagon, watching the county roll by. Her father had called it the Bad 40, though it ran closer to 45, and had said a man would be a fool to put money into ground that buckthorn had taken over so completely. He was not wrong about the buckthorn. European buckthorn had moved through that part of the upper Midwest like a slow green tide for a generation, consuming the understory of every woodlot it touched, poisoning the leaf litter with its own chemistry so that native plants could not re-establish. The Griswold family had farmed the open acres on the southern edge, abandoned it when the brush took over, stopped paying taxes, and drifted west. The land sat for 11 years under its bristled canopy, going nowhere, worth nothing. Assessed so low the county had practically apologized when it filed the lien. What her father had not known, what no one in Harlow County knew because no one had any reason to go looking, was what lived under 30 years of compressed leaf litter and matted root, under the dense alkaline shadow of the buckthorn. Margaret knew, or thought she knew, because she had read. She had spent 3 winters in the town, lending library, working through every agricultural pamphlet and land survey addendum the librarian, a small, fierce woman named Mrs. Paulson, could locate. What she had learned was this: European buckthorn, for all its damage, did not destroy the mineral soil beneath it. It altered the chemistry of the upper horizon, yes. It suppressed everything around it with ruthless efficiency. But the ground it sat on was often glacially deposited, heavy with calcium, and the years of its own leaf litter, once disturbed and turned, broke down into a deep, dark soil that grew things with an almost violent gratitude. She had read that in a university extension pamphlet from the Agricultural College at Madison. She had read it twice, and then a third time, and then she had sat in the library with the smell of old paper around her and the snow coming down outside the window, and done the arithmetic on the back of an envelope. The arithmetic said, if the soil is there, and the buckthorn can be removed, and she had enough of something that could clear brush faster than hired labor she could not afford, she had something. She needed a clearance agent that worked for hay and did not require wages. She had heard from a Bohemian farmer named Joseph Krall, who kept a few goats on the rocky hillside south of town, that his animals would eat buckthorn back to the root if they could reach it. Joseph was a small, leather-colored man of about 60 who walked with a stick and spoke in a way that placed every word deliberately, like setting stones in a wall. "Goats," he had told her once, when she had stopped to help him reset a fence post, "do not know what they are not supposed to eat. This is their genius." He had smiled at his own joke, and then, more seriously, "Young buckthorn, when it is coming back, they will clear it 3 years in a row, and the root gives up. Older stand. They eat the leaves, the bark, if you let them. It weakens. Then you pull the rest. It is slow, but the land remembers what it was before." He had looked at her the way a person looks at someone they think might understand something. Land always remembers. She had written that down when she got home, and she wrote down a great many things that winter. By the time she bid on the Griswold parcel that March, she had already located 12 Boer-crossed does and a proven billy from a dispersal sale east of St. Paul, arranged to buy them on 30-day terms from a man who thought she would default and borrowed her cousin Edwin's truck for the transport. She paid the $280 for the land, walked to the telegraph office, and wired the goat man her confirmation. The clerk at the telegraph office looked at her message, which contained the word "goats" 4 times, and said nothing. But he told his wife at supper, and his wife told 2 other women at church. And within a week the prevailing opinion in Harlow was that the young Voss woman had paid good money for bad brush, and was planning to run animals on it that were generally understood to be the most ridiculous and least dignified livestock a person could keep. They arrived in April, 13 of them, in a crate on the back of a hired wagon, and they were indeed ridiculous. They had the amber eyes with the horizontal pupils that make a goat look as though it is perpetually calculating something slightly outside the frame of ordinary concern. 2 of the younger ones had ears that flopped forward in a way that made them appear to be listening too intently to a private conversation. The billy, a thick-necked animal Margaret had quietly named Abelard because she felt he had philosophical pretensions, surveyed the wall of buckthorn from the wagon bed with an expression of focused appetite that she found deeply reassuring. A girl named Ida Schwartz, who was 9 years old and lived on the farm whose eastern boundary touched the Griswold parcel, had been watching from the fence. She had positioned herself there each morning for a week since hearing about the goats, and when they finally arrived, she climbed to the top rail and named all 13 of them within the first hour, with a speed and certainty that Margaret found remarkable. By noon, Abelard was Abelard. The 2 floppy-eared young does were Clementine and Dorothea. The large gray doe, who walked with the particular authority of a creature that has never doubted herself, was, without discussion, the queen. Margaret did not argue with any of these designations. Ida came every morning after her own chores to check on them, report any fence trouble she had spotted, and address each goat individually by name, and Margaret came to rely on this in a way she had not expected to. She built a temporary fold in the southwestern corner of the parcel and began letting the animals into the buckthorn in sections, moving them on a rotation that Joseph had sketched out for her on the back of a flour sack. Heavy grazing for 3 weeks. Then move them out and let the weakened plants attempt to re-sprout. Then bring them back. The re-sprouting growth, being young and soft, was the most nutritious and the most eagerly consumed. Joseph explained it to her the first time he walked the property with her, tapping the base of a buckthorn trunk with his stick. It fights back, and in fighting, it spends itself. You are borrowing its own stubbornness against it. This is the correct way to fight things that are stubborn. In the evenings, she would walk the worked sections alone, pulling cut buckthorn with a mattock and wrist-thick gloves, piling it in the open areas where she would burn it in October when the air was damp enough to be safe. The work was the kind that filled the body completely and left the mind quiet and deliberate, And she used those hours to do the forward arithmetic. How many seasons of rotation to clear the northern two-thirds, what the cleared land might carry once the grass came back, what a season's hay might be worth, what the goats themselves might produce in milk and in kids for sale, once the operation was stable. She wrote these figures on the wall of the fold in pencil, rewriting them as conditions changed, and she protected them from rain and from visitors with the same instinct, that particular instinct of someone who has been mocked for hoping and has learned to hold their hope in a place where mockery cannot reach it. No one in Harlow knew how it was going because she did not tell them. She took her meals alone. She bought fencing supplies from the hardware man, Deacon Pitts, in amounts so modest they drew no attention. She nodded to people at the post office and answered their questions about the goats with remarks so brief and unrevealing that the questioners came away feeling strangely outmaneuvered without being able to say why. The opinion of the town stabilized into a kind of pitying indifference. She had done a foolish thing, and she was too stubborn to admit it, and eventually the land would win, the way it always won, and she would move on, and the 45 acres would revert to brush, and the whole episode would be forgotten. This is what Harlow believed, and Harlow was comfortable with it. And so the months passed. What Harlow did not know, could not know, because she had kept the secret with the careful precision of a woman who had seen what hope looks like when it is laughed out of a room. What Harlow did not know was that, by the end of the first summer, the southeastern quarter of the parcel was already yielding grass. Real grass. Prairie grass coming up through the disturbed litter where the goats had worked the buckthorn back hard enough, and she had followed behind with the mattock and the burning pile. It was not lush. It was sparse and low and a little pale, the grass of a soil still adjusting to light it had not seen in 30 years. But it was there, and she would crouch in it in the long August evenings with one hand flat on the ground and feel the warmth the soil held after dark. And she understood that warmth as the land doing what Joseph had said it would do, remembering. By the second full season, August arriving like the open door of a furnace, she had cleared and burned nearly 18 of the 45 acres, and the grass on the early cleared sections had deepened and spread in a way that made her breath come short when she walked it. She had 51 goats by now, because 12 of the original does had kidded in spring, and she had kept the best of the female offspring and sold the rest, which had covered her fencing costs entirely and put $12 over. She had moved the goats in 3 working groups, running them in sequence through the rotation Joseph had taught her, and then refining it through 2 seasons of watching what the animals preferred and what the land responded to. She had learned to read the buckthorn, which stands were weakening, which were years yet from surrender, where the soil beneath was richest, where it was still alkaline and would need another turn. She had learned it the way you learn a difficult language, slowly at first, then suddenly with a fluency that made the difficulty hard to remember. It was Joseph who first told her what he had heard one evening in late August when he came to walk the boundary with her, as he did every few weeks. He told her quietly, in the way of a man who knows the information will sting and wants to hand it gently. A man named Gordon Achterberg, who was the primary grain and produce dealer in Harlow and who operated a sideline in land brokerage and commodity buying, had been asking questions about the Griswold parcel. He had asked at the courthouse about the tax status. He had asked the hardware man, Deacon Pitts, about her purchasing. He had asked 3 different farmers who bordered the parcel whether they had any idea what she was doing over there and whether the operation looked viable. He had asked these questions in the smooth, solicitous voice he used when he was interested in something and did not want to appear interested, the voice that the older farmers of the county recognized as the voice Gordon Achterberg used before he made a low offer on something he had already decided to have. Margaret listened to this without expression. They were standing at the northeastern corner of the property, where the buckthorn still stood uncleared and thick, and she looked at the wall of it in the amber late light. "What does he think the land is worth?" she said. It was not quite a question. Joseph turned his stick in his hands. He will offer you what you paid for it. 280, perhaps 300. He will tell you the work is not progressing, that the brush is winning, that you will be better served to cut your losses while the offer is good. He paused. He will say someone alone cannot manage a reclamation of this scale. He will say it as a concern. Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "How does he know what I paid?" Joseph smiled faintly. "He knows what everyone paid for everything. This is his profession." She went home that night and did the arithmetic again on a fresh sheet of paper by lamplight, with a deliberateness she had not felt the need for in some months. The figures had not changed. What the cleared land could carry, what it would yield, what the timber value of the standing buckthorn was, once cut and dried, as firewood and as fence-post material for which the local market was perennially short. She had not acted on the timber value yet, because she had not needed to and because she was still learning the property. But it was there, in the numbers, like a coal banked low under ash. Waiting. She added it carefully. She sat with the total for a long moment. Then she blew out the lamp and went to sleep. Gordon Achterberg appeared at her fence on a morning in early September, arriving in a good coat and a clean hat and the expression of a man doing someone a favor. He was perhaps 50, with a dealer's accommodating face and the particular attentiveness of someone measuring everything they see for a price. He greeted her warmly. He remarked on the heat. He looked at the cleared acreage with a performance of concerned appraisal and said he had heard from several quarters that she was working awfully hard out here, and he wondered if she had given any thought to the practical limits of a one-person operation, especially heading into a second winter with the carrying costs accumulating and the real work of clearing still mostly ahead. She listened to all of this without interrupting. The goats were audible in the middle section, and Abelard made a sound from behind the fold gate that was, in context, philosophically appropriate. When Achterberg was finished, she said, "I appreciate you coming out." She said it in the same tone in which she said everything, which was plain and considered, and gave nothing away. "I'm not interested in selling," she paused. "The carrying costs are current. The clearing is more than halfway done." She said this last piece as a fact, in the way of someone reporting a measurement they have personally taken and watched something flicker at the back of his eyes, the faintest recalibration. "But I thank you for your concern," she added, and went back to what she was doing. He stayed another 3 minutes, adding 2 more iterations of concern, and then left. She watched the wagon go without any particular feeling. Being right, she had found, is its own kind of reply. You do not need to furnish it with words. The third spring brought a crisis that had nothing to do with Gordon Achterberg. It had been a dry autumn and a nearly snowless winter, and by April the creek that ran along the southern boundary, which she had been counting on for stock water through the summer, was running at less than a third of its normal flow, and the long-range signs that Joseph read in the sky and the wind, and the behavior of certain birds, were not encouraging. He told her in March, turning his face into the southwest where the clouds were wrong, that they were going to have a dry summer. The old country had a name for this, he said. I do not know the English. He thought about it. A hungry year. Not nothing. But everything will be harder and smaller, and whatever a man has been counting on will be half of what he expected. He looked at her. Whatever you have set aside, it is time to set aside more. She went home and did the arithmetic a different way. Without reliable creek water, she would need to either haul water for 51 goats from the town cistern at a cost that would consume the summer's profit, or drill a well, which she could not afford, or reduce the herd to what the diminished creek could carry, which she calculated at approximately 28 animals. She spent 3 days running the numbers different ways and arriving at the same place each time. She sold 23 goats in April at fair market price, keeping the best milkers and the best brush workers, and she sold them quickly and quietly, and with the calmness of someone executing a plan rather than reacting to a disaster. She put the money aside. The summer that followed was the summer that broke a dozen operations in Harlow County. The creek fell to a thread by July. The communal well in town dropped 8 feet. Calvert Brandt, who farmed 200 acres of grain east of town and who had been one of the men on the bench at the feed store when the wagon driver asked his question, lost 2/3 of his corn. Reed Hooper, who ran 120 head of cattle on pasture that had gone brown and cracked by August, was hauling water from 15 miles and losing cattle anyway. 3 other families who had put up hay from dry-side fields found their stacks smaller by half, and their animals needing feed they had not bought and could not find. The county as a whole, which had gone into summer confident of an ordinary year, came out of it shaken and short, and looking for ways to cover debt that had quietly tripled while they were watching the wrong sky. Margaret's cleared acres held. This was the thing that not a single person in Harlow could have predicted, because not a single person in Harlow had understood what she had been doing or what she had been building toward. The prairie grass that had come back on the early cleared sections, grown now through 2 full seasons, its root systems reaching down into that deep, dark, calcium-rich soil that the buckthorn had left behind, held moisture differently than the surrounding fields. It did not flourish in the drought. She was not going to claim it flourished, but it held. The deep roots went down past the dry surface horizon and found what was there, and the old prairie grasses, which had evolved through 1,000 dry seasons and knew something about survival that bred grain varieties had forgotten, cropped back and stayed green in the center when the edges browned, and when she cut hay in late July from the 12 cleared acres she had put into pasture management, she got 3/4 of what she had projected in an ordinary year. 3/4 of a conservative projection in the worst drought the county had seen in 11 years. She put up 52 tons of hay in the pole barn she had built the previous autumn on the southern end of the parcel, using lumber she had bought with the timber sales from the first buckthorn cutting, and she locked the barn, and she said nothing to anyone, because this is what she did, and she had learned by now that telling Harlow anything before Harlow needed to know it was a waste of a perfectly good silence. Harlow began to need to know in October. Calvert Brandt came first. Because of all the men who had sat on the bench at the feed store, he was the least proud and the most honest about his own position, which was that he had 60 cattle going into winter and feed enough for perhaps 40. He came to her fence on an October morning with his hat in his hands, literally, and he asked her in a flat, careful voice that contained the whole labor of a proud man asking for help whether she had any hay to sell. His face was the face of someone who has rehearsed a conversation many times and is finding the real version harder than the rehearsed one. She had the arithmetic of it ready because she had known someone would come and had run the numbers each way to know what she could sell without compromising her own winter. She could sell 30 tons and keep 22, which was more than her reduced herd required. She looked at Calvert Brandt's hat turning in his hands, and she told him her price, which was fair, and he blinked at it in a way that said he had expected to be charged what the moment was worth, which was considerably more. "That's your price," he said, and it was not quite a question. "That's my price," she said. He nodded once with the depth of a man who is nodding for a more complex reason than agreement. He came back the next day with his wagon, and she loaded it. He told Reed Hooper, and Reed Hooper came that same week, and she sold him 8 tons at the same price and kept the rest against her own needs and against whatever else the winter might bring. By November 4, more families had bought hay from her, all at the same fair price, all leaving with the same expression Calvert Brandt had worn, that particular expression of a person who went into a conversation expecting one thing and found themselves inside a different story entirely. It was during the November transactions that Gordon Achterberg reappeared. He came not to her fence this time, but to the feed store, where he held a quiet conversation with Deacon Pitts about hay prices and availability in the county, a conversation that Deacon recounted to his wife, who recounted it to Mrs. Paulson at the library, who wrote Margaret a brief note, 2 sentences, in her precise handwriting, which said, "G.A. is inquiring about your inventory and your contracts. He appears to believe you may be open to assigning your remaining stock at a wholesale rate. He is mistaken in this belief, I assume. Mrs. P." Margaret had read this note 3 times, and felt something warm settle in her chest that was not quite affection for the town, and not quite the opposite of it either. She put the note in her coat pocket. Ochterberg came to the farm on a gray Wednesday morning, arriving again in his good coat and his dealer's cordiality, and this time there was a different quality to his performance, a faint current of urgency under the smooth surface, because a man who buys and brokers commodities in a drought year knows exactly what hay is worth in November, and the number was not small. He proposed to her, in the unhurried manner of a man explaining a favor, that she consider allowing him to broker the sale of her remaining inventory at a price he named, which was below what she had already received in private sale, with a commission to himself that he described as modest and she recognized as not. He said that managing inventory of this size individually was demanding work for a single operator, and that he had the relationships and the infrastructure to move it efficiently and ensure she received fair value. She let him finish. She was aware of Ida Schwartz on the top rail of the eastern fence, watching with frank attention. "I've sold 22 tons already," Margaret said. "Fair price to the families that needed it." She told him the price. "There are 6 tons remaining, and they are committed to the Holst family for January delivery. There is no inventory left to broker." She looked at him steadily. "What made you think there was more?" Something moved in Ochterberg's careful face. He said he had understood the yield to be higher, that he had heard figures suggesting a larger stock. "How much larger?" she said. He caught himself and said something about the county generally. "The county," she said. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment in which a great deal was said without any of it being said aloud. "Thank you for coming out." The second time she had told him this, in the same tone, from the same fence. He heard it the second time even more clearly than the first, and he left. Ida jumped down from the rail. "He thought you had more," she said, with the directness of a 9-year-old who sees no reason not to name things. "He was told I had more," Margaret said. "Somebody counted." Ida thought about this for a moment. Who would do that? Margaret looked at the parcel, at the 27 acres of cleared and working land, the bare cold furrows where the latest section had been worked over and burned and rested through the fall, waiting for spring, at the 26 acres still in Buckthorn, still standing gray and bristled and cold, but thinner than they had been, and, for anyone who knew how to read them, weakening. "Someone who wanted to offer low once I was worried and needed quick money," she said. "The drought was the moment for it. He waited for the moment." She paused. "He waited a little too long." Joseph came in December, on a day when the first real snow had fallen, and the parcel lay clean and white and quiet. He walked the property with her as he always did, tapping the dormant buckthorn with his stick, examining the soil where the exposed sections had frozen, bending with difficulty to pick up a handful of the dark earth from the edge of the most recently cleared section and hold it to the light, turning it in his leathery fingers. The earth was dark as coffee, heavy with organic material, alive in the complex way that real soil is alive when it has been given enough time to become itself. "2 more seasons," he said, "maybe 3 in the northern third where the stand is oldest." He let the soil fall. "Then it is all yours." She stood beside him and looked at the white expanse of it, the cleared portions smooth under snow, the buckthorn sections rising dark and sparse at the northern end, thinned and diminished from what they had been 3 springs ago when she stood at this line with her hand on the first fence post and the whole 45 acres bristled and closed before her. 45 acres of scorned, poisoned, written-off ground that the county had been so relieved to be rid of it had sold it for the price of a good horse, and felt it had done well. "It is good ground," Joseph said, in the same tone in which he said everything important, the tone of a man who is not decorating the truth but simply handing it to you. It was always good ground. It only needed someone to believe this before it proved it. He glanced at her with his dark eyes. "Land always remembers. You did not teach it anything new. You only helped it remember faster." It was the same thing he had told her at the beginning. She heard it differently now, or perhaps she heard the same thing and was different. March of 1890 brought the cedar post wagon and the red-faced man named Creel, who stood in front of the feed store holding the invoice, and said simply, he would be damned. He was not the only conversion that season. A surveyor who had been hired by a neighboring county operation to assess comparable properties came out to the Griswold parcel, which was no longer really the Griswold parcel in anyone's reckoning, and walked the cleared acreage with his instruments and his ledger, and wrote a figure in the ledger that caused him to go back and recheck his measurements 3 times before he accepted them. He asked Margaret, as she walked the property with him, how many acres were now under active grass management. She told him 31. He wrote it down and then stood for a moment looking at it. It was that same spring, in the 3rd week of April, that Ida Schwartz discovered the stone structure. She had been checking the northeastern fence line, as she did every morning, moving in the particular intent way of a child performing a real task, and she came back to the fold at a run, boots loud on the thawing ground, face alight in a way that made all 13 of the second generation does look up from their breakfast with the wide-pupiled interest of animals who can distinguish between a person running toward danger and a person running toward discovery. Ida was running toward discovery. "There is a building under there," she said, pointing north. The Buckthorn in the northern section was the oldest and the most established, the place Joseph had said would take 2 more seasons to clear fully, and it had grown so thick for so long that what it contained had simply ceased to be visible from any angle and had passed out of living memory, along with the people who had known it was there. Margaret had assumed, from the slight rise in the terrain under the thicket, that it was a glacial deposit, a boulder cluster, the kind of subsurface irregularity that the upper Midwest is full of. She had not assumed a building. It was, when they had cut enough buckthorn away that afternoon to see it, when the gray stone emerged from the green-bristled dark one, course at a time, as they cleared back from the southern face. A jail. A proper frontier jail, constructed of fitted limestone blocks, 4 courses high to a corbelled top, with iron fixtures still set in the window openings, and a door frame of hand-hewn oak, still plumb and square, after what the county records would later confirm was 34 years of standing in the brush. It had been built in the county's earliest settlement days, decommissioned when the new brick courthouse was completed, and abandoned on the outlying parcel when the Griswold family bought it in the 1860s. It had then been comprehensively forgotten by everyone except the buckthorn. The stone was good. A mason from town named Parvanen came out at Margaret's request, walking around the structure with his professional deliberateness, tapping the mortar, examining the coursework, pressing on the corners with the flat of both hands. He said the walls were sound. He said the craftsmanship was better than most of what was being built in the county today, delivered in the precise tone of a man for whom this is not a compliment to the present, but a tribute to the past. He said with a new roof and some repointing of the interior mortar, it would stand another 100 years without argument. Margaret stood with Joseph outside the building in the long evening light, watching the last of the buckthorn cuttings being hauled away from around its base, the stone emerging section by section into the open air, pale and firm and whole. The goats were moving in the adjoining section in the oblique gold of late April, Abelard at the front of the group with his expression of weighty philosophical engagement, the queen behind him with her air of one who has never once questioned her own authority. Clementine and Dorothea were engaged in an energetic and apparently principled dispute over a particularly choice young buckthorn shoot that neither of them had any intention of yielding. The cleared ground ran south and east in long grass-covered sweeps, greening up now after the winter in a way that made the whole parcel look like something assembled on purpose by someone who knew what they were doing. "You did not know it was there," Joseph said. He meant the jail, but she understood him to mean more than the jail. "No," she said. "The land kept it." He turned his stick in his hands. "This is what I mean. The land keeps things. Things you do not know to look for. Things the brush hides." He gestured at the cleared acres, the grazing animals, the gray stone structure sitting open now in the light of what was approximately the most ordinary and complete April evening she had ever witnessed. You asked it a good question. It gave you an answer larger than the question. She looked at the land, at all of it, at what 45 scorned and written off and buckthorn-strangled acres had turned out to be once something stubborn enough had set to work on them: the grass, the soil, the goats moving through the last of the thicket with their amber eyes and their beautiful, indiscriminate hunger. The stone jail standing open to the sky for the first time in a generation, solid and plumb, and wholly unbothered by anything the years had thrown at it. She had started this with $400, a borrowed truck, and a pamphlet from the Agricultural College at Madison. She was not the same person who had sat in Mrs. Paulson's library, reading that pamphlet for the third time with the snow coming down and the whole town of Harlow making up its mind about her. She could feel the distance between those two versions of herself, the way you feel the distance of a crossing you have made when you stand on the far bank and look back at where you started, and the distance is surprising and not unpleasant. "You told me the land remembers," she said to Joseph. "Yes." "I think people do too," she said. "Eventually?" He considered this with the gravity he gave all propositions that he thought might be true. "Eventually," he agreed, "some faster than others. The faintest edge of a smile. A drought helps." She laughed, and it came out genuine and without restraint, which was something she would not have predicted of herself 3 years before. Ida, who was sitting on the cornerstone of the jail with her notebook, in which she had recorded the names of all the goats and the dates of notable events, looked up at the sound of it and smiled back for reasons she could not have articulated but felt clearly. The stone building would become a storage house the following summer, the fieldstone cleaned and the mortar pointed and the oak door frame fitted with new hardware. The hand-hewn threshold, worn smooth by the feet of whatever number of Harlow County's earliest inhabitants had passed over it in the 1850s and 60s, was kept exactly as it was. Margaret kept it as it was because she understood something about thresholds, that they carry the weight of all the crossings they have witnessed, and that weight is not a burden but a record, and records are worth keeping. She added 9 more acres to clear in the 4th year, paid Joseph back for every piece of practical knowledge she had taken from him with a winter's supply of firewood delivered to his door every November for the rest of his life, without comment or accounting, and bought the eastern fence line strip from Ida Schwartz's father in 1892 when he needed the capital, paying him a price that was honest, not exploitative, at a moment when he was not in a position to negotiate, and she was. He remembered this and said so, years later, and she told him the price had been fair, which it had, and that was all she said about it. By 1893 she was running 58 goats on a cleared and managed 48 acres, cutting hay from 26 of them, selling breeding stock to 3 other operations that had watched the results from across the fence for 4 years and made up their minds. She had a reputation in the county as the person to ask about land reclamation, and she answered the questions that came to her with the patient specificity of someone who has genuinely earned what they know. She could look at a stand of buckthorn on a stranger's property and tell them from the stem diameter and the density of the canopy approximately how many seasons of rotation the reclamation would take, what quality of soil they were likely to find underneath, and what the realistic carrying value would be once the work was done. She gave this information freely, in the same spirit she gave the fair price and the honest answer, in the spirit of someone who has learned that generosity is not a subtraction from what you have, but an addition to the world you have to live in. The folding chair silence of the auction room in March of 1887 was long since past. There was a different silence now, the silence of a good working morning on a property that was doing what it was supposed to do, that had been given the chance to remember what it was, and had remembered it completely. Abelard moved in the last northern section with his ageless philosophical appetite, the queen behind him, the whole herd working the brush in the steady, purposeful way of creatures who have found a vocation that suits them. In the beginning, they had all said the land was worthless. They had said it because it was covered in something they did not like, and they had looked at the covering and not at the thing beneath it. This is a very human habit, this confusing of the surface with the substance, the condition with the nature, the brush with the ground. It is easy to do. It is perhaps the easiest thing people do, and certainly one of the most expensive. The land had always known what it was. It had kept that knowledge through 30 years of shadow and silence, banked like a coal under ash, waiting for the particular kind of person who would ask it the right question, who would come at it with goats and a mattock and a pamphlet and $400 and more stubbornness than sense, and the correct, patient, irreducible belief that underneath the worst of what a thing has become, the good ground is still there. It is still there. It is almost always still there.